Today I want to do an overview of the works on MK Ultra and kind of give an introduction to that because it's a topic that I've put a lot of time and research into over the last 20 years. I've read a lot of the mainline works on it and some of the documents themselves, and I think it would be good to do basically a course on this. So this little video is going to function as an introduction, and then for subscribers to Jay's Analysis, I'm going to do a full-on lecture in high quality that deals with the totality of what's called MK Ultra, which is really just a whole bunch of little projects that use that moniker. This comes out of the military's wartime research back in the 40s, seeking a truth serum. So MK Ultra begins as a project by the military, by the Army, to find different drugs that might be useful under espionage circumstances to get a person to tell the truth. And so if you had a captured a POW or something like that, could we get him to divulge enemy secrets? And alongside that, there was separate research in other countries like Tavistock, which we've covered in the past, which dealt with PTSD, basically. Shell shock was what it was initially called. They got a big grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to invest more time and research into the subject of psychological warfare, group dynamics, and basically mind control. So both countries had parallel programs running, and as we get into the post-World War II era, other countries as well kind of hopped on board and did their own projects like the Soviets. And we also see similar projects that the CIA farmed out in other countries, which I've covered recently over on Rockfin in Australia. For example, Australia had a huge number of MK Ultra related projects that most people don't know about. Some examples that kind of piqued people's interest in this back in the 70s before the hearings that occurred. It was there were situations where subliminals were coming out. There was subliminals that were run in New Zealand on different TV channels back in the 80s, which basically attempted to see if, as a black operation, you could get people to do heinous, horrendous actions such as murder and whatnot. We don't know the real extent of that because actually a lot of these projects were covered up and eventually shredded by Richard Helms when he becomes the director of the CIA. Now, if we go back to the 40s and 50s, John C. Lilly, for example, the famous dolphin mind controller that we've talked about, the guy literally trying to program Flipper with LSD and other programs. He was involved in putting electrodes into various animals back in the 40s and 50s, and he covers this in his books. We've covered those in my lectures. And we also, of course, know about Dr. Ewan Cameron in Canada, McGill University, his program of psychic driving and re-imprinting the human mind, and he experimented with sleep deprivation, with we know that Lilly had the float tanks, for example. Dr. Jolyon West, who ironically has worked with multiple famous killers. We know that he, for example, was connected to Jack Ruby. We know he's connected to even Tim McVeigh. Dr. Jolyon West is known for giving LSD in experiments to elephants at the zoo, actually. So maybe Harambe was actually an MK Ultra. I'm joking. I don't really believe that. Somebody will clip that and say I really meant that, but I'm just joking. Now, one of these famous doctors, also Dr. Gottlieb, who was involved in a lot of the, what we typically know of as kind of the MK Ultra mind control assassin type of projects. Now, Dr. Gottlieb, for example, was involved in Operation Spellbinder, which was the intentional project to actually create a mind-controlled assassin. And again, we don't know how successful that was, but under the arm of the Dulles brothers, CIA connection to Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, we got the production of LSD, and that was also connected to the Ford Foundation, the Macy Foundation, as well as bankers from JP Morgan like Gordon Wasson, who were seeking these different entheogens and different drugs that could be the perfect truth serums, which actually they found out that the LSD trip process actually was more like a religious conversion or a dissociative state. That's covered in John Marx's book, for example. And this is where we get figures that are known as counterculture figures like Tim Leary, who himself in many clips, I'll try to include it right here, admitted that the counterculture of the 1960s was really authored by the establishment themselves at a higher level. So while a lot of people in the mainstream thought that the 60s movement, the flower children nonsense, Haight-Ashbury, they think that was a counterculture movement. Really, this was funded by a lot of very powerful elitist interests, particularly people connected to the intelligence communities, people connected to very wealthy and powerful international banking families. The CFR also had connections to other operations such as foreign mind control operations, and examples of this would be various figures that were connected to, for example, cults like Scientology. We know that Scientology comes out of people connected to military intelligence like L. Ron Hubbard, and Crowley himself, the famous former member of the Golden Dawn, who went on to become the most famous Satanist of the 20th century. Crowley himself was, of course, a British intelligence asset around the time of World War I, and he would be used at different times by people like Ian Fleming and MI6 to do various, small operations or asset work. Then, of course, we come up into the modern time, and that cult arena is still there with people like Michael Aquino, who authored the document From Mind War to Psy War. And so when we get into the specific projects that I'm going to mention in this overview video that give us an outline of what kind of stuff we're talking about here, we have to keep in mind that it includes everything from LSD, biowarfare research, toxicity research. Biometrics is eventually what it becomes. It gets renamed as biometrics, just like the old EUGENICS programs became biometrics as well. Julian Huxley discusses this in his Philosophy of UNESCO essay, that it basically just has to rename all of the former EUGENICS programs into biometrics. And it went so far as that the CIA was invested in studying black magic, sorcery, voodooism, the occult on all levels. And this is where you, of course, you've probably heard of the remote viewing, Stanford Research, and those projects. Most famously, we'll get into some of the listed projects. Subproject 68, this is when people hear about MKUltra, they're probably thinking about the Dr. Ewan Cameron experiments about electroshock, sleep deprivation, and what he called depatterning, which is basically operating on the assumption that the human mind is a tabula rasa, and if we could kind of reboot it, if you're experimenting on people that have drug problems, experimenting on people that are in these altered states or in these sort of mentally deficient states, could you reboot the brain? So there's this implicit technocratic view that the human mind is just a computer to be rebooted at work in these experiments. And this will actually also parallel with John C. Lilly's book, Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, where he actually says that the human brain is really just a biological computer, and we can literally mind control it just as you would control anything else, like a computer. Subproject 3 is a situation where they utilized sexual entrapment. You've probably heard of things like Midnight Climax, where the CIA, together with organized crime, utilized a prostitution house, a house of ill repute, in order to secretly test the Johns and give them LSD and see how they reacted to this. That one came out in the Senate Investigation Committees in 1975. No prior consent was obtained. This was an illegal experiment on the Johns. And we know that from subproject 68, some 80 institutions were connected to and participated in various MKUltra operations. One of those was, of course, experiments on prisoners at Vacaville under Dr. James Hamilton. This was funded by a chain of front organizations. The CIA had many of these, such as Human Ecology Fund, had many front organizations in Australia that it ran these fronts through. Really, you could see Tavistock as another one of these kind of front operations, which has normativity cover. The CIA and the U.S. Army initiated multiple projects such as Third Chance and Derby Hat. These were connected to different psychiatric institutions, New York Psychiatric Institute. The Army experimented on 1,000 servicemen volunteers, giving them LSD at Fort Bragg between 1955 and 1958, as well as at the chemical warfare laboratories at Edgewood. So Edgewood Arsenal, these different outfits were not just experimenting on prisoners, but also and psychiatric patients, but also on troops that had enlisted. And of course, we know the dangers and the serious effects of LSD, and yet here you have basically being a property and owned by the state. The state has the right, and they think, to potentially mess you up. Now, keep in mind, too, this is all under the guise of the Cold War. What's the justification for this? Well, we have to do all this because most Soviets, right? The Soviets are going to beat us. And we know nowadays that a lot of those claims are exaggerated. All of the buildup of the Soviet Empire and whatnot, that was actually exaggerated by Western intelligence to foster and fund these kinds of operations. MK Delta is another one of these famous programs. You've probably heard of we think of Delta Force and these kinds of things. Delta and dealt with the interrogation of suspects who were possibly foreign agents that was done at CIA safe houses and in American occupied war zones. So they were able to get around legalities by doing it offshore or doing it under the cover of safe houses and national security. Operation Mindbender was a covert operation in Mexico City that involved the use of undercover hypnotherapists to determine whether a suspected victim could be influenced by drugs and hypnosis. So here we have the combination of, again, the things that we typically think of as MKUltra that we see in Hollywood movies. This is under Operation Mindbender. The idea here was, could we use hypnosis and drugs to create a mind-controlled assassin that could be programmed through a specific trigger word, the code word. MK Search dealt with biowarfare agents. This was Dr. Gottlieb and Dr. Gottlieb's experimentation on human expendables, as he called them. And this is where basically all of MKUltra, when it was investigated, it morphed into MK Search, and it became a program of biowarfare, biological agents at Fort Detrick. And so it also was named and known as MK Naomi. It involved a lot of civilian research and even faking suicides and basically faking people's suicides. This was run by Dr. Harold Abramson. He was allocated $85,000 by Dr. Gottlieb to participate in these kinds of assassination and suicide experiments using toxic substances. Operation Big City was a attempt to test the effects in 1953 of a car that would emit a gas that would affect the citizens by emitting an LSD sprayed in a gas form. We don't know exactly what the analysis of this research concluded, but the idea was, could we test and see what happened to LSD being sprayed in confined areas upon a large group of people. In San Francisco, a biological gas was released off of the Golden Gate Bridge with the intention of covering the city and monitoring the gas and its effects. I mean, you could just think some of these cities themselves are basically just giant mind control experiments. Operation Resurrection, Dr. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute. This was experimentation on apes and animals to see what would happen with various RF frequencies, and signals. And what this did was to basically hype up the animals, get them really upset. And as a result, some of them would even engage in violent behavior. We can, again, think of Brzezinski's section in Technocratic Era, where he says that the ELF, VLF signals they knew back in the 70s could basically agitate or calm large areas and regions. The agency set up a front called the Amazon Natural Drug Company in Peru, by which they also did a lot of experiments and gathered various leaves, roots, barks from the jungle to basically see if you could get these various drugs to basically get the monkeys to kill each other. And in fact, this was a success. It says they did actually achieve that. The monkeys basically went nuts. This makes me think of something like The Kingsman, right? Where you have either chemicals or RF signals, or that movie with John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson called Cell, based on the Stephen King story, where a combination of biological agents and cell signals are able to basically agitate people and get them going crazy. Operation Spellbinder was another one that attempts to create a MKUltra mind-controlled assassin. Spellbinder is really what we think of when we think of Manchurian Candidate. It was one of the projects that was less than successful. The less successful Operation Mindbender, in other words, was renamed the Operation Spellbinder, which was supposedly more successful, but exactly how successful we don't know. So again, remember that when Richard Helms becomes CIA director, he basically destroys most of the documents relating to a lot of these projects. But Spellbinder was what you typically think of in terms of Hollywood movies. Subproject 142, Subproject 94, these deal with biological programs of electric brain stimulation and implants. So basically, could we then also create mind-controlled assassins or agents who are really just receivers and emitters of information? So could we use a person who's himself a kind of recorder to surveil things, and then they come back and they give us the information knowingly or unknowingly? And if you have followed my work over the years, you know I covered the Schwitz Gibble machine, and it's actually listed in this essay's list of projects and programs related to MKUltra, which I didn't expect. A lot of people are not aware of the Schwitz Gibble machine, which is really the iPhone. It's really the cell phone. It's really the tracking device, biofeedback loop that we're all now using. Related to Gottlieb's operations and the creation of a mind-controlled, basically robot person, is the Phoenix program, although the Phoenix program is not listed in this person's essay, that actually does relate to the Phoenix program, because that was about the creation of basically a serial killer. And if you know Dave McGowan's work, he theorizes that some of the people that came back from Vietnam who were serial killers might have been involved in this kind of a program. And they were used to terrorize the Viet Cong. I think that's very plausible. Operation Often is another example of the usage of sorcery, black magic, sexual entrapment, sex magic, the kinds of things that we see in Crowley or in more recent court cases, the kinds of things that we see in the Stanford Research Institute studies like remote viewing, Project Stargate. These are all projects that dealt with trying to weaponize and control the occult. Michael Aquino, a big part of that, obviously, with his essays and his doctrine of psychological warfare. And then we get to the Schwitz Gibble machine, which, as I said, was a kind of biofeedback loop that would transmit and receive signals, so that originally prisoners would wear these devices and they would self-police and self-imprison themselves, because they knew if they were tracked and traced and all the information was fed back and forth to computers, it would basically cause them to rearrange and reformulate their psychological, their view of themselves. So they would police themselves. And by the time, as I said, Richard Helms in 1972 canceled these projects and sent a message out to destroy all of the documents because they were going to be investigated. So 130 boxes were later discovered, and those supposedly are the ones that he didn't get to. So half of them supposedly he destroyed, is the story. Half of them he supposedly didn't get to. So we don't know all of what happened with MKUltra, but really, if you know about the history of DARPA and you know about the history of biometrics and where the research and development arm of the DEEP, STATE, took things, then you know that what happens with the NSA and with the rise of the national security state is that they basically take all of this Cold War knowledge of MKUltra and they implement it in situations like Gulf War. So the Gulf War was when we first started to see biometrics being rolled out on a mass scale with the biometric tagging and tracing of Iraqis. And ultimately, as we said, as is the thesis of Annie Jacobson's book, that is all intended to be weaponized and turned domestically on us, la population. So what is the purpose of all this? Well, what we're going to do in this lecture, try to make it probably an hour, half, 2 hour lecture, where I'm going to go in deep into all of the big picture. What is MKUltra really about? And I think that you'll enjoy it. I think that most people are, a lot of this has come out, even in mainstream. NPR, I think last year did a big piece admitting basically all of this, which for the last 20 years, if you've researched this for 20 years like I have, you know that this has largely been in the domain of the so-called conspiracy people, even though it's not even up for debate. I mean, you can access court cases. I'll put one below. You can access a lot of these documents that have been declassified, and we already know a large part of what's been going on. So this is just a lot of public ignorance. A lot of people have cognitive dissonance. They have confirmation bias. They don't want this to be true, and so they just ignore it. They deny it, and they don't know what they're talking about. I've read, again, most of the books on this topic that are out there, and I would say too that this. Now, another way to remember to fight this type of a thing is to fight the biofeedback food war that's out there. And that's why you want to be arming yourself, right? You want to have the right diet. You want to not be eating all of these horrible junky things. You want to not be eating synthetic fake foods. You want to not be eating fast foods. You want to have a healthy, traditional, organic type of diet. For me, it's keto carnivore. You may find something better that works for you, but you definitely want to get off of this corporate Fortune 100 meal system, because that is one of the biggest weapons in all of this. So one way, by the way, that if you want to get into that, you can start with Chalk.com. That's one of our top sponsors at Jay's Analysis. Chalk.com is one of the key elements in fighting against big soy. If you want to boost your testosterone, proven through Chalk.com's Long Jack, in terms of the Tomcat, which is the key ingredient in Tomcat for boosting testosterone, is proven in multiple studies. You can go look at Chalk.com. They have hundreds of 5-star reviews. If you want to support companies that are 100% organic, go to Chalk.com and use the promo code that's down below to take advantage of that. But I want to remind you too, subscribe to Jay's Analysis. I've done longer, in-depth analyses of this document and about 60 other of the global elite documents that, from their own vantage point, right? We lecture through these one by one. You get access to that when you go to Jay's Analysis and you subscribe to the members section for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year.